Hey, what's up, everybody? All right. When I was 4 years old, my parents bought me a puppy. And I still have these fuzzy little kid memories of going into the pet store at the mall and picking out a little Boston Terrier puppy, which is just like an adorable little smushy nose kind of dog. And for reasons I cannot remember, I named him Gruber, which is not a name and is not a word. But I was 4, and I was making stuff up. So Gruber, there he is. I know, right? Gruber became my best buddy, probably because at the time my siblings were 2 and a baby, and so they were utterly useless in terms of having someone to play with or have fun with. So it was just me and Gruber all day, every day. And then about 4 years passed, and Gruber got sick. Gruber got what is called valley fever. It's an infection that dogs can get, and it can be highly treatable, but in some cases, it can become fatal. And so I remember we were going back and forth to the vet, and we were giving him medicine and trying everything that we could, and Gruber just got sicker and sicker. And one day, the vet told my dad, there's nothing else we can do. He's not responding to the medication. He's not going to get any better. He's suffering. The most humane thing to do is put him down. And I lost it. I was not prepared at 8 years old to deal with this. And a couple days later, I distinctly remember my dad coming home early from work. He told me to say goodbye to Gruber, and then he took him to the vet to have him put down. And a couple hours later, my dad comes back, and he's holding what is the saddest thing you'll ever see as a pet owner. It's a leash and a collar that no longer has an owner. It's straight up Tiny Tim, Ghost of Christmas Future kind of stuff. And then he also walked in the door that day with a plan. My dad, in his logical dad mind, had been thinking all afternoon as he's going through this that, man, I've got 3 kids at home. At this point, we're 8, 6, and 4. We were all just wrecked about Gruber. And so he's trying to think, how can I help my family? How can I bring some joy and some healing? And so he steps in the door and he says, okay, I know we are all just so sad about Gruber, but tonight I'm taking us all out. All right, we're going to go get pizza. We're going to go to the movies. We're going to watch something funny and just try to have some joy and laughter in our lives. And even more perfect, I'm sure, to my dad's logical dad mind, this was 1992. And at that exact moment, the hit family comedy in theaters was the movie Beethoven. Yeah, some of you see where this is going. It's a dog movie. You could argue, hey, Dad, swing and a miss, bro. But he's doing his best. And so we go to Beethoven because the previews had lied to us. We had seen the previews. We had seen the commercials. It looked like just 90 minutes of a family and their big dog just having fun and laughing, and the dog creates all sorts of messes, and no one dies, and everything's super. Have you ever gone to a movie and find out that the preview painted a very different picture than what the movie was actually going to be like? I want you guys to see for yourselves on all of our campuses the lengths Universal Pictures was willing to go to trick us into going to see this movie. Let's just see what the preview for Beethoven showed us.
Throughout the history of motion pictures, there have been many big dog stars. But now, Ivan Reitman, who brought you Ghostbusters, Kindergarten Cop, and Twins, proudly presents the biggest dog star of them all. Beethoven.
No.
What?
Oh, I just love these big dumb animals.
Beethoven.
Right? So fun. It's going to be great. Just the whole family is going to love it. The movie opens. First scene, fade up from black. We meet 2 bumbling crooks who are driving a big truck around on a dark, rainy night, stealing dogs and bringing them to an evil vet so he can perform dangerous and deadly experiments on the dogs. It gets worse. An hour into the movie, Beethoven has become a part of this family. He's caused so much laughter and fun and hilarity. He's saved a little girl. Everyone loves Beethoven. That same evil vet tells his goons that he wants them to bring Beethoven specifically to him because he needs a dog that big to test, hear me now, a new super deadly handgun ammunition. So let me set the scene for you. 1992, Phoenix Movie Theater. My father took our dog to a vet who killed it. Then brought his children and set them in chairs in a movie theater. Gave them popcorn and soda, tears and snot from earlier still drying on our faces. And he set us in front of the screen so we could watch this moment.
I'm saving you! I'm saving you! He pushed me on the ground and I couldn't get out. He got out of it.
Nice guy. We're gonna have a little field test of this new ammo. So,
We lost our minds. We could not handle it. And I'm going to spoiler alert this whole thing for you, okay? The dad rushes in, Beethoven doesn't get shot in the face, the good guys win, the bad guys lose. But no one in the theater that night could hear any of it because there were 3 children in the front row screaming and wailing and crying over the trauma we were witnessing. My dear sweet dad accidentally, well, he intentionally took our dog to a vet to have him killed, and then accidentally brought his kids to a movie to watch a vet kill lots of other dogs. It was the greatest dad fail in the history of the world. It would have been less traumatizing if he had chosen to have a dog skin rug made out of Gruber and then made me use him as a bath mat for the rest of my childhood. I probably would have been more well-adjusted today had that been his course of action. But that, ladies and gentlemen, was my first experience in life with the concept of death. I'm messed up forever. Thanks, Dad. Death is not something we want to talk about. If you don't believe it, that's why I came out here and spent all this time telling this awful dog death story, because I can't just hit the stage and be like, hey, we're all gonna die someday, let's talk about it. You'd all leave. But death is a very real issue. In case you were unaware, sorry, it's something 100% of us are going to have to face at some point. We are all gonna die. And as we wrap up this series, where we've been looking at these really big questions that kind of make up the foundation of how we look at the world and what we believe and how we live our lives, we can't just kind of gloss over this issue of death because it's a huge part of this worldview that we're creating. And so we've talked about the issue of origin. Where do we come from? And then we talked about meaning. Why are we here? Last week we covered morality and how do we determine right from wrong. And tonight we're going to zoom in on this question of destiny. Where are we going? Like, what happens after we die? Which I know is a heavy topic, but we have to look at it at some point. We have to know confidently where we think we're going and why we believe that that's where we're going and what happens. And the trickiest thing about this question versus all the others that we've covered is that this is the one that has the least amount of science we can dig into, right? Like as soon as we start talking about an afterlife or a soul or whatever you want to call it, we are now decidedly out of the world of matter and molecules and stuff that we can really examine and look at, and we are talking about a spiritual issue. And so while there's 1,000 different ways we could take this conversation tonight, I just want to zoom in real quick on an event. I want to talk about one thing that happened in history that I think provides more clues to what there is coming after this life and gives us more confidence to know and trust and believe that we know where we're going after we die. And that event is the resurrection of Jesus. And when I say that, when I bring that up, I'm sure it just, in your mind, whether you are a Christ follower or whether you're just totally skeptical, either way, so glad you're here. When we hear that, we hear the resurrection of Jesus, we start to think of like, okay, Easter and Bible stories. And I think what happens to a lot of us is that when we start talking about something that's in here, is it opens up this category in our mind of faith and spiritual things, and that's absolutely a component of what's in here. But it's easy to forget that the events and the people that are talked about and written about in the Bible are real people in real places at real moments in history. And so as we look at the resurrection of Jesus for a minute, I want, if you can with me, look at it more from the history, factual textbook side of life and not just the spiritual Bible story side. Make sense? And there's like so many reasons we could talk about why I personally and many scholars believe that there is it's so hard to doubt the resurrection of Jesus actually happened. There is so much evidence pointing to, no, this really took place almost 2,000 years ago over in the Middle East. And tonight I just want to look at two real quick evidences that are two of my favorites that strengthen my faith whenever I face some doubts or a tough conversation with someone. These are two things that I keep coming back to that I can't find a good logical reason against. All right, the first one is the leaders of the day, the political, religious leaders of Jesus' day had every reason to prove the resurrection false if it were false. Without getting like too boring and too into the weeds of all this, if you're not brushed up on the story, Jesus was crucified near Jerusalem, which is in Israel, way over in the Middle East. And there were these Jewish religious leaders who had some sort of social and religious authority over the people of Israel. At the same time, the Roman Empire had taken over most of the world, and they ruled over Israel. So the Roman governors allowed the Jewish rulers to have some authority as long as they kept the Jewish people in line, was the gist of it. And then Jesus, though he said he willingly gave up his life, he could have stopped it at any point, but he chose to go through that for you and for me. Jesus allowed this political climate to be the method by which he would die for our sins. Okay, so the Jewish leaders basically went to the Roman authorities, set Jesus up so that Rome would kill Jesus. And Jesus was hung on a cross, and he was killed, and he was buried in a tomb on a Friday. And then the Jewish leaders had been paying attention. As Jesus was starting to like teach and preach, and thousands of people were starting to follow him, they were freaking out. Because not only was Jesus calling them out for their hypocrisy, but he was introducing this new way that people would connect with God that was going to strip these Jewish leaders of all their authority. And so they paid attention when he was teaching. He said over and over again, hey, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise again 3 days later. And so the Jewish leaders, right after Jesus was buried, they went to the Roman governors and said, hey, we remember this guy that you just killed for us. He's like had this story that he was going to rise from the dead. So could you please send some soldiers to guard the tomb and make sure that no one tries to like steal his body so that they could like claim this false rumor and it's just going to be bad for everybody. So the Roman governors sent the guards to make sure no one went in or out of that tomb. And then, if you're familiar with the story, Sunday morning happens. There's an earthquake. There are angels. The guards pass out because their brains can't even handle what they're seeing right now. Stone moves, and Jesus stands up and walks out. And he appears to a few of his followers, and then they run and tell some more followers, and those followers aren't so sure, but then Jesus appears to them, and then they start telling other people, and this rumor starts to spread on Sunday morning that Jesus is alive. And if that were not the case, these Roman leaders, these Jewish leaders, as soon as they caught wind that this rumor is spreading, they would march out to this tomb and say, no, he's right there. Dead Jesus, just like we left him on Friday, right there. But they couldn't do that. The body was gone. And now, like a logical kind of question would be like, okay, well, maybe the disciples did steal the body. Like somehow they got in there, they stole that because they wanted to honor their leader, which actually leads to my second favorite reason that I trust the resurrection absolutely happened. And that's the transformation these disciples went through after encountering the risen Jesus. Okay, we could talk about how there's no way this ragtag bunch of 11 scaredy cats could get past these well-armed, well-trained, absolutely brutal Roman guards to steal a body. That's not going to happen. You also look at the story, and these disciples didn't even realize Jesus was supposed to rise from the dead. Like, he told them over and over again, and it just didn't click for some reason. So on Sunday morning, they're not scheming to, like, set some rumor on fire that's going to blow up the whole world. They're sitting there scared and helpless and sad, wondering what to do next. And then Jesus shows up. But the most convincing thing to me is as you look at these guys who were just kind of nobodies. I'm not trying to talk down about them, but they just weren't people of influence. They weren't terribly skilled outside of fishing or like doing accounting. And they were just kind of these dudes. And suddenly, after they spend time with Jesus after his resurrection, they become these bold, powerful leaders that proclaim everywhere across the whole known world that Jesus Christ died for everyone's sins and he rose from the dead. And all of them faced suffering and torture and arrests and beatings because of it. And almost all of them were brutally executed by Rome for claiming that Jesus was God and he had risen from the dead. And you can't convince me that 11 different guys spread over the world at different points in history went knowingly to their execution for something they knew was a lie. They didn't face their death based on like hopes and wishes and faith. They were so 100% sure, no, I have seen the risen Jesus. I spoke with him. I touched him. Jesus rose from the dead. And all of them were willing to face their death boldly because of that. You can't convince me that that's a scam, that that's a fraud. And the reason that we could go on and on, but the reason this fills me with such confidence and puts me at such peace when I start to wonder, like, man, death is a freaky thing, is that Jesus' resurrection does two incredibly important things. First, it provides foreshadowing. Remember English class? Foreshadowing about what's to come. Okay, Jesus rose from the dead, indicating that there is something more to this life. Okay, because as soon as you talk about a dude rising from the dead and walking around, you have now exited the world of molecules and stuff that we can observe, and you're now talking about something supernatural. But more than that, it gives us confidence and sets us free from fear. And it gives us this confidence that what Jesus promised us, which was so much, but specifically about the afterlife, is true. You can trust what Jesus has to say. Because if Jesus over and over said, I'm going to die and I'm going to rise from the dead, which he did say, and then he does that, man, everything else he said seems pretty trustworthy to me. And Jesus taught a lot about the afterlife. It was one of the things he talked about most. And he very clearly over and over said there is a heaven, there is a hell, and everyone faces something when they die. And one of the most comforting and encouraging and clear passages Jesus ever said about the afterlife, or about heaven, is in John 14. And he's trying to encourage his disciples. He's again warning them, hey, we're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. I'm going to rise from the dead. They still didn't get it. But in chapter 14, starting in verse 1, Jesus said this, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. There is more than enough room in my Father's home. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I will come and get you so that you will always be with me where I am. Jesus promised his own death and resurrection, and he did it. Jesus promised that he is going to prepare a place for all of his followers to be with him forever, and so he will. We can trust that. We can know that. We can have confidence in that. And as I alluded to earlier, more than just hope, more than just like trying to soften how uncomfortable death is, Jesus' resurrection sets us free from fear. Like, fear is a big deal, right? You have fears, I have fears. We are the most anxious generation in society, in history. We are all scared of stuff. But Jesus argued that his resurrection should set us free from so many things, from guilt and shame and condemnation, but also from fear. To put it as like simply and concisely as I possibly can, knowing what's next in terms of an afterlife removes fear now. And here's where I get that idea. It comes also from the Bible, out of the book of Hebrews. And I know I have thrown a lot at you in the last few minutes. So I just want to give you this passage, have you discuss it more in your groups. But I hope that you'll just kind of chew on this and think about the implications of what it says in the book of Hebrews, chapter 2, starting in verse 14. Because God's children, that's us, are human beings, made of flesh and blood, the Son, that's Jesus, also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. Hear this now, this is so good. Only in this way could he set free all who have lived their lives as slaves to the fear of dying. Jesus took the scariest thing in human existence, which is death. And he took the fear right out of it. He took the scariest thing you or I will ever face, which is this concept of like someday the lights are going to go out and what happens then. He took that fear and crushed it. And so in light of that, what is left to be afraid of? I'm not trying to belittle your phobias or your anxieties. I have them too. I get it. But in the big picture, what do we have to be afraid of? From a faith standpoint, what could possibly be so scary, so frightening that we shouldn't do whatever God calls us to do when the scariest thing we'll ever deal with has been dealt with? Students, when Jesus walked out of that tomb on a Sunday morning, he said that death was not a big deal anymore. He said that is done, that is over, that does not have power over any Christ follower. Death is done. And he did that to set us free to really live, to actually live the kind of life we were designed to live, the kind of life that you long for deep in your heart. Jesus set us free to that when he set us free from this fear of death. And so the question I have for everybody on every campus is a simple one. What have you been afraid of? What is it? What's that thing that's been holding you back? Because I believe every one of us has something we've been wrestling with God about. There is some step, some action, some act of faith he's been pushing us towards. And the devil's favorite trick is throwing fear in there to stop us in our tracks. And I don't know what that is for you. It could be a lot of things. It might be something like sharing your faith with your friend or your teammate, starting a conversation, inviting them to church. For some of you, it could be, I see this a lot, it could be getting baptized. Like you've been around for a while and you get the Jesus thing and you believe and you want to follow him, but for some reason this thought of getting in the water and publicly declaring that has you freaked out. Some of you, it might be opening up about a struggle. Like you've been dealing with something secretly and you keep trying to fix it and you can't and you're just terrified to tell anybody. It might be going on a missions trip. It might be changing some major things about your college and your career path because you feel God's moving you in a direction that freaks you out, but you know he's pushing you that direction. I don't know what it is. I don't know what you're wrestling with. I don't know what you're scared of. But in light of the fact that you have nothing to fear from death, man, what could you have to fear down here? Jesus rose from the dead to set us free from fear so that we could truly live the life he designed us to live. I hope, I pray that this week, even tonight, as you head to your groups and start to talk about this, that you will admit what you've been afraid of. You'll admit it to yourself, you'll admit it to God, maybe you'll admit it to your group, and that you would have the boldness and the courage to take whatever step you need to take this week. Let me pray for you guys. God, I thank you for who you are, for what you've done. Thank you hardly begins to cover it when we look at what you went through for us in your death. And God, how you rose from the dead, proving that you were exactly who you said you were and setting us free from everything. God, I pray for boldness in these students all across this valley. And God, that their lives would be changed and the lives of those around them would be changed because they are no longer slaves to fear, but they follow you with everything. We love you, Lord. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.